Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going on a deep dive into a truly pivotal moment in history. The Hijra, the Prophet Muhammad's migration from Mecca to Medina back in 622 CE. You know, it's a story we hear often, but today we're going to examine it a bit differently.
Yeah, like with a more like a practical lens, you know what I mean? Like we often hear about the faith and courage involved, and rightly so, but I think it's fascinating to kind of dig into the nitty-gritty logistics of what such a journey would actually, demand.
Yeah, I like that. So we're talking about a journey of roughly 340 kilometers across the Arabian desert, right? Mm-hmm. And the traditional account says they did this in a mere 8 days.
8 days, yeah. It's pretty mind-blowing when you stop and think about it. Imagine just the scorching heat alone. It regularly gets over 40 degrees Celsius out there.
Yeah, 104 degrees Fahrenheit for those who prefer that. I mean, I can't even imagine what that would be like to walk in day after day. You need gallons of water, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Water is the make or break element in that kind of environment. We're talking 5 to 10 liters per person daily just for basic survival. And with the exertion of walking that far, carrying supplies, that number probably doubles easily.
So 10 liters minimum per person per day. Okay, now do the math for me because I'm not great at math on the spot. That's 8 days times 10 liters. That's 80 liters per person.
You got it. And then multiply that by 2 for the Prophet and Abu Bakr. That's 160 liters of water. And let me blow your mind a little further here. 1 liter of water weighs 1 kilogram.
Okay, so we're talking 160 kilograms of water.
160 kilos. That's like imagine carrying a full-grown adult male lion on your back for 340 kilometers. Does that sound feasible?
No, not even a little bit. And we haven't even talked about the food they would need or how they'd protect themselves, or what about like wild animals or hostile tribes or...
You're hitting all the key points. It starts to feel less like a covert escape and more like an impossible feat of, I don't know, superhuman strength.
Right. So if the traditional account is, let's be honest, pretty hard to square with the practical realities, what are we missing? Like, where do we go from here?
Well, for starters, we need to think bigger. The sources emphasize the Prophet and Abu Bakr, and that's important. But for this journey to even remotely be possible, we got to widen the lens a little bit.
What do you mean by think bigger? Like bigger picture?
Yeah, exactly. Like who else might have been involved? Who had been responsible for carrying all that water, providing food, ensuring their safety? A 2-person journey through the desert, especially one as dangerous as this one, would be almost suicidally risky.
Oh, I see what you mean. So maybe it wasn't just the two of them. Maybe there was like a larger group, like a small caravan or something.
Now you're getting it. Think about it. 10 to 15 people, maybe even more, to share the burdens, to keep watch, to deal with any problems that might pop up.
That makes a lot more sense just from a pure practicality standpoint.
Yeah.
And that also brings up this question of camels, right? I mean, surely they wouldn't have attempted this entirely on foot.
You're spot on. Camels were the lifeblood of desert travel for a reason. They could carry heavy loads, they were adapted to the heat, and think about it. Trade routes already crisscrossed the Arabian Peninsula at that time. They wouldn't have been going through completely uncharted territory. Camels would have been essential.
Okay, so now we're picturing a small caravan, maybe some camels laden with supplies, moving through the desert.
Right, and probably traveling mainly at night to avoid the worst of the heat, navigating by the stars, relying on guides who knew the terrain like the back of their hands, maybe even knowing secret water sources or safe havens.
So it becomes less about an 8-day sprint and more like a meticulously planned expedition.
Absolutely, and realistically, it probably took them longer, maybe 12 or 15 days, to cover that distance safely. The traditional narrative might compress the timeline for emphasis, focusing more on the spiritual journey.
Right. I'm starting to see how the pieces of this historical puzzle might actually fit together. But there's still one image that pops into my head when I think about the Hijra, and that's the story of the Cave of Thawr, where the spiderweb supposedly hid the entrance.
Oh, yeah. That's such a powerful image, isn't it? It speaks to the idea of divine protection, of miracles happening in moments of great need.
Exactly. But if we're putting on our analytical hats here, we have to ask, how quickly do spider webs actually form, especially in a dry, windy desert? And how sturdy would they be?
Yeah, it raises some good questions. It reminds us that sometimes the symbolic power of a story and the practical realities might not completely align. And that's okay. It doesn't diminish the importance of the story.
This is getting really interesting. So if the 340-kilometer trek from Mecca to Medina on foot in just 8 days is, well, let's say highly unlikely, where does that leave us? What are we to make of the Hijra as a historical event?
It makes us wonder, right? Like, what if we shifted our focus a bit? What if instead of Mecca to Medina, we looked at a hypothetical journey, say from Petra to Jerusalem? That's a distance of roughly 110 kilometers, just to give you a reference point.
Petra to Jerusalem. So still a desert trek, but a lot shorter.
But wouldn't the same challenges apply? I mean, it's still the desert, right?
To some extent, yeah. But here's the thing. The terrain between Petra and Jerusalem is way different from the open expanse of the Arabian desert. We're talking mountains, valleys, gorges, even some vegetation in certain areas.
Wait, wouldn't that actually be an advantage? Like more natural shelter from the sun, maybe even some reliable water sources along the way?
Bingo. The landscape makes a huge difference here. Plus, the shorter distance means the water needs would be drastically lower. Even factoring in the more challenging terrain, the ups and downs, a journey of, say, 3 to 5 days seems plausible.
Okay, so water might not be as much of a limiting factor, but what about navigation? Would they still have relied on the stars to find their way? They could, for sure. But the terrain itself provides a lot more landmarks, valleys, peaks, distinct rock formations. It'd be much easier to follow a path, even at night, when you have these visual markers.
I see. And if we're imagining a group of, let's say, 10 to 15 people, wouldn't they inevitably leave some sort of trail? Like footprints, disturbed vegetation, wouldn't that make it harder to stay hidden?
Absolutely. Covering your tracks would be much tougher in this kind of environment, which means the secrecy, so crucial to the prophet's journey, would need to be even more meticulously maintained.
It adds a whole other layer of complexity. And it makes me think about the historical context. The prophet was seeking a safe haven, escaping persecution in Mecca.
Exactly. So if we're playing out this Petra to Jerusalem scenario, we have to ask, what kind of threat would necessitate such a clandestine journey in this particular region? Were there political factions, religious tensions, maybe even rival groups vying for power that would force them to travel in secrecy?
Ooh, now those are some thought-provoking questions. And it makes me think about the physical skills needed for this hypothetical journey. Would they be different from those needed for surviving in the open desert?
Definitely. Instead of enduring relentless heat and navigating vast distances, they'd need a different skill set. Agility for navigating those mountain paths, maybe even some basic climbing techniques, and knowledge of local flora and fauna. Could they find edible plants, springs or streams hidden in the mountains? It's a whole different set of survival skills.
Just less about pure desert survival and more about, being really in tune with that specific environment, using the natural features to your advantage.
Exactly. And while camels might still be useful, for carrying supplies, they wouldn't be as absolutely essential as in the wide open desert.
Okay, so it sounds like this Petra to Jerusalem journey could possibly be squeezed into that traditional 8-day time frame. Is that what you're saying?
It's definitely more plausible. The shorter distance, the varied terrain offering potential shelter and water sources, all those factors make it more feasible.
But hold on. We can't forget about that crucial element of secrecy. If this was a truly covert operation, wouldn't they need to avoid established routes, settlements, things like that? Wouldn't that add time and complexity to the journey?
100%. Imagine them taking the back roads, so to speak. Navigating through hidden passes and valleys. Even if the overall distance is shorter, the actual path they take could end up being much longer and far more arduous.
And of course, just like in the Mecca-Medina scenario, the time of year would play a huge role, wouldn't it?
Huge. Imagine trying to traverse those mountains in the middle of winter. You could encounter snow, ice, freezing temperatures. That would add a whole other level of difficulty to the journey.
So even though it's a shorter distance on paper, this Petra to Jerusalem route, it wouldn't exactly be a walk in the park. It comes with its own unique set of challenges.
Right. It's a different kind of survival puzzle. And this comparison, I think, helps us understand how the traditional narrative of the Hijra might have been shaped by the specific geographical context of the Arabian desert,
I get what you mean. It's almost like the landscape itself becomes a character in the story, influencing the events and shaping the narrative.
Exactly. And by looking at these geographical factors, I think we can start to really appreciate the sheer logistical complexities of moving a group of people across such challenging terrain.
It's like we're using a magnifying glass on history, trying to see those finer details that often get blurred in the grand narrative.
I like that. And through this process, we gain a deeper understanding not just of the event itself, but of the human capacity for adaptation, ingenuity, and that collective effort in the face of what seem like impossible odds.
So we've explored these two hypothetical journeys, both with their unique challenges. But where does this leave us with the actual Hijra, the one from Mecca to Medina? What insights can we glean from this comparison?
So we're back to the Mecca to Medina journey. And we've kind of established that a solo trek on foot in just 8 days, well, it's highly unlikely, to put it mildly.
Yeah. We've talked about the need for a larger group, the use of camels, a more realistic time frame, all that stuff. But I'm wondering, are there any whispers, any hints within the historical accounts themselves that might support a more, let's say, practical perspective?
There are. While the main sources focus on the Prophet Muhammad and Abu Bakr, you do find these fleeting mentions of other figures involved. There's this guy, Abdullah ibn Urayqid. He was a guy familiar with the desert routes. He wasn't a Muslim himself, but he's said to have assisted them.
Oh, interesting. So even within the traditional narrative, there's this acknowledgement of the need for, specialized knowledge, local expertise. It wasn't just a matter of two individuals striking out on their own.
Exactly. And we can't forget about the Ansar, the people of Medina who welcomed the Prophet and his followers. They would have played a huge role in orchestrating the logistics. Think about it. Providing supplies, setting up safe havens along the route, maybe even having scouts out to ensure their safe passage.
Okay, so now we're talking about a much more coordinated effort, right? A whole network of individuals working behind the scenes to make this journey possible.
It starts to look like a pretty sophisticated operation, doesn't it? Not just two guys wandering off into the desert with, a few dates and a water skin.
Yeah.
It suggests a level of organization, strategic planning that often gets overshadowed by the emphasis on faith and divine protection.
This brings us back to that whole element of secrecy. If we're talking about a more complex operation, how did they manage to pull this off without arousing suspicion back in Mecca?
Well, think about the context. Mecca was a major hub of trade, right? There were established lines of communication, people coming and going all the time. It's quite possible messages were relayed discreetly, maybe through merchants, travelers, perhaps even hidden within everyday transactions.
It sounds like we're uncovering a historical spy thriller here.
Yeah.
Secret routes, coded messages, a race against time. It definitely adds another layer of intrigue to the story.
And let's not downplay the element of faith, the belief in a higher purpose, the trust in divine guidance, the unwavering commitment to building this new community. All of that would fuel their determination, help them push through the immense challenges.
It really is a remarkable blend of human will and, logistical mastery is what makes the story so enduring.
Absolutely. The Hijra reminds us that even the most extraordinary events in history, they're shaped by those grand narratives of faith and also by those practical realities, that human ingenuity.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Hijra, what are some of the key takeaways our listeners should keep in mind?
Well, first off, the immense symbolic significance of this journey. It's a timeless story about perseverance, about faith, about seeking freedom. It still resonates with people today.
And what else?
I think we can appreciate the story on an even deeper level when we apply that, critical lens, when we recognize the logistics involved, the human resourcefulness, the strategic brilliance that made it all possible.
Well, finally.
Most importantly, maybe, is that we're reminded that history isn't this fixed, static thing. It's a living, breathing tapestry. It's woven from multiple threads, faith, resilience, and those often overlooked but crucial details of logistics, of planning, of navigating a really harsh world.
I love that analogy. And for those listening who want to delve deeper, here's something to ponder. What other historical events might we re-examine with this same approach? This blend of scientific analysis and critical thinking. What hidden details or alternative perspectives might we discover?
Ooh, that's a great challenge. History is an invitation, It invites us to engage, to question, to keep rediscovering its depths.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Hijra. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep diving deep.